Welcome to everyone who is joining us on the live stream of this National Centre for Writing event, Translation as Witness. It will be a conversation between Ko Ko Thett and Shash Trevett, two incredibly experienced writers, translators, and editors. Very briefly, before I introduce the poets and get us going, I thought that given today's events, I would share a quotation from the poet Anna Akhmatova, as translated by Richard McCain, from her poem Requiem, which she committed to memory before burning to keep it safe. As a poem on the underground in London in 1995, it was my first public encounter with the long history of witness poetry, of literary dissidence and resistance. And I'm sure this will be familiar to some of you. The hour of remembrance has drawn close again. I see you, hear you, feel you. The one they could hardly get to the window, the one who no longer walks on this earth, the one who shook her beautiful head and said, "Coming here is like coming home." I would like to name them all, but they took away the list and there's no way of finding them. For them I have woven a wide shroud from the humble words I heard among them. I remember them always, everywhere. I will never forget them, whatever comes. And we're very fortunate tonight to be joined by two wonderful word weavers and witness bearers. And I'll tell you a little about each of them. Ko Ko Thett is a Burma-born poet, literary translator, and poetry editor for Mekong Review. He started writing poems for Samizdat pamphlets at the Yangon Institute of Technology in the 1990s. After a brush with the authorities in the 1996 student protest and a brief detention, he left Burma in 1997 and has led an itinerant life ever since. Thett has published and edited several collections of poetry and translations in both Burmese and English. His poems are widely translated and anthologized, and his translation work has been recognized with an English Pen Award. Thett's most recent poetry collection is Bamboo Phobia from Zephyr Press, which is published this year. He lives in Norwich, UK, and has recently co-edited with Brian Haman the anthology that we are celebrating and launching tonight, which features voices from the ground of Myanmar revolution. And the title is Picking Off New Shoots Will Not Stop the Spring. Witness poems and essays from Burma, Myanmar, brackets 1988 to 2021. There's a limited print run of 700 copies, but there's also an ebook available online free of charge, and there'll be a link for that in the chat now. And our second speaker this evening is Shash Trevett. She's a Tamil from Sri Lanka who came to the UK to escape the civil war. She is a poet and a translator of Tamil poetry into English and has written about this in her piece Creativity and Claustrophobia, which appeared on the NCW website. Her pamphlet, titled From a Borrowed Land, which includes original translations, was published in 2021 by Smith/Doorstop. She's currently editing and translating with Vijayana Ravindran and Seni Senevaratne Out of Sri Lanka, post-independence poetry in Tamil, Sinhala and English from Sri Lanka and its diaspora communities. It's going to have to be a big spine for that title, Shash. And it's an anthology of Tamil, English, and Sinhala poetry from Sri Lanka and its diaspora communities, and it will be published by Blood Acts in 2023. So the format for this evening's event is that I will be taking chair's privilege to ask Shash and Ko Ko some questions to get us started. But this event belongs to all of you who are watching. So please share your respectful and excellent questions and comments in the YouTube chat, and we will see them. We'll be shared them on the Zoom and we'll come to them around 7:30. But I'm going to start by asking about these anthologies. I'll just say the titles again. Picking Off New Shoots Will Not Stop the Spring. Witness poems and essays from Burma, Myanmar, 1988 to 2021. And Out of Sri Lanka, poetry in English, translated from Tamil and Sinhala. Yes, have I got all of the title there? Shash?
Yes.
Yes. And I know that attentive audience members will have read about this event and read about the anthologies, but I think it would be great to hear about them in your own words, to maybe hear about the key timeline of events or literary practice that they cover, why it was so important to create these books now, and also how you came to each work on them as editor and translator. And I'm going to ask Ko Ko first, because your book was just published this month. Congratulations. So tell us a bit about it and how you came to be involved with it.
Thank you. So it's quite, we didn't conceive the anthology project until the 2021 military coup. But, after the coup, we felt the need to preserve the writing, online writings, resistance writings, anguish, rage, all these things, proliferating online in a more durable format. That's how Brian Haman and I started discussing about it. And by the 15th of February, the coup happened on the 1st of February. By the 15th of February, we reached out to Ethos Books and we presented to them our vision that we would like to publish this book within a year. And it wouldn't be any commercial, it will be pro bono. So we started doing that. Of course, to begin with, prior to 2021 military coup, there was the so-called transition to democracy in Myanmar, after nearly half a century of dictatorship that began in 1962. So that transition was neither fair nor inclusive, but when it comes to freedom of expression, the country experienced a watershed movement. The internet was introduced in the 2010s, and much of the censorship was lifted in 2012. So it's really surprising how the people from Myanmar easily adapted to the newfound freedom and technology, especially online technology. So there was, in that decade of 2010s, transitional decade, there was this proliferation of all sorts of writings online. And the practice continued after the military coup. And thus, and we decided to document those writings. And then in March and May 2021, my poet friends, two of them, Keza Win and Kathy, they were murdered in the protests. And so the anthology turned into a project also to preserve their memory. Yes.
I think that's incredibly complex, and we'll come to this question of the complex work that anthologies do, holding memory in particular. And Shash, I know that's very important for the anthology that you've been working on, which is holding also multi-generational memory, like Ko Ko was saying. I wonder if you can say a bit about how you became involved with this project and what it's going to be, because we don't get to see it till next year.
Hi, yes. Well, it was the brainchild of Vivian Ravindran, and he contacted me to ask for input on Tamil writers writing in English originally, because he originally thought of this as an Anglophone volume. So as we started talking, he invited me to join him, which was great. And then we both asked Saini whether she would join us. So for the past 2 years, all three of us have been meeting regularly and going through so many poems, because our anthologies, it's nominally post-independence, although we are featuring one poet from before independence, because he's so fundamental to the landscape of Sri Lankan poetics. So that's George Cate, who was writing in the 1930s. So it's sort of 1948 to 2021. And we also put out a call for submissions, and we've had lots of emerging poets send us wonderful poems. So we're featuring them as well. But like you say, I mean, the 30-year civil war, which ended in 2009 with much bloodshed, history changed so much, and people changed and the society changed, and we're trying to capture that in this volume. This volume is also going to be the first volume of poetry from Sri Lanka and its diaspora communities to be published in the UK. So there hasn't been a publication like this before. So we're trying to be as diverse as possible and to capture as many voices as we can. And I think we probably talk about the pitfalls of anthologizing, but that's one thing that we've been very aware. We want to be as representative as possible without being too thin on the ground.
That's definitely something that I'd like to pick up on, while also noting that the fact this is the first anthology of Sri Lankan writing published in the UK points to some deep-seated problems in the UK publishing landscape, which perhaps we can discuss as we go through, or we might come to with audience questions, and why it's so important the National Centre for Writing has done so much to include translators and to include writers from multiple communities in the UK. And in a sense, that's the question that I want to ask about the anthology, and the idea that anthology can be a form of collective politics. So in the introduction to an anthology that Shash alerted me to, which I encourage everyone to read, called Lost Evenings, Lost Lives, translated and edited by Lakshmi Holmström and Sasha Eberling, they noticed that the anthology form offers, on the one hand, an awareness of a particular history, in their case by the poets who spoke for the Tamil community as a whole, but also, quote, the multiplicity of voices and the disparate positions held by the poets. So I'm interested what that anthology as a form offers you as editors and translators who are holding witness, because you could have chosen to publish one poet or a book of a sort of history rather than a poetry, and in Ko Ko, in your case, essay anthology as well, you have multiple forms. So Shash, you were picking up on that, so maybe we can go to you first.
Yeah, sure. It's a great responsibility in many ways, because I am a Tamil and I've had my experiences of warfare, and for me, I am aligned to a Tamil sensibility. But at the same time as the Tamil people were suffering in the north, the Sinhala majority had their own preoccupations and suffering in the south. And I think it's important that we recognize in this anthology that over these last 30 years, that almost everybody in Sri Lanka has been touched by the civil war, whether they've been displaced or murdered or have had family members disappear, or whether they've been victims of Tamil Tiger terrorist attacks. We wanted to bring Sri Lankan literature to the UK, and we had to cast a very wide net. I've had to neutralize my viewpoint in many ways while editing this. Because at one point I was reading about blood and mud and finding mass graves. And in the next point, I'm reading a poem by a Sinhala writer in translation, which is about having a picnic by a river with his lover. And the two just do not seem to meet at all. And how do you make sense of this? I mean, it's a small island. And as tourists go and sunbathe on the beach 200 miles further north, the same beach, the same ocean is covered in blood. So it's just trying to hold all of these contradictions within one volume, plus bring in a historical span and look at how poetics, Sri Lankan poetics, has changed from the departure of the English to a sort of modern age of TikTok and spoken word poetry. That was also something that made us all sit up and think about what we're doing. So yeah, an anthology can flatten, and but there's so much out there that isn't being read in this country. that we didn't want to just concentrate on a few key individual poets. And in a way, having an anthology meant that we could actually bring in quite a diverse viewpoints and diverse voices and diverse subject matters. So yeah, I think I'm hoping that when people read our anthology, that we're going to only feature about 2 or 3 poems by each poet, that they will then want to go off and explore these poets themselves, that this is like a tasting menu, really.
And Ko Ko, you're a very experienced editor, not just in the anthology form, but in the magazine form for Mekong Review as well. And in a sense, you were encountering a different version of the same situation where, as you said, there was suddenly this upwelling, this onrush, and we all know how overwhelming online encounters can be. So how are you managing that flow of information to produce an anthology that both spoke to the particular and had that range and disparate coverage?
Yes, there are 2 kinds of writings that I have seen since the 2021 coup. One of them appear online usually on social media, and the other also published in the diaspora journals such as Momaka, based in California, a Mies magazine. So these I have to, plenty and plenty of poems and essays. I winnowed them, but I tried my best. We tried our best to offer, politics in a plural form, located in witness, as opposed to politics as a singular voice. So there are, poems about, especially in the 2010, 2020 section, there are poems about perfume for men, football, pets, and so on. So to illustrate the point, can I read a poem, a short one by Hannah Lynn? It's called When I Perfume Myself. It's from 2010, 2020 section. Han Lin is a great poet and a musician as well, a music teacher. He teaches guitar, and he was arrested in March 2021 in a protest, along with many other poets in Rangoon. But the group, the cohort of poets, the arrested poets, they were released in June, fortunately. But of course, many other poets remain in jail. So this is by Han Lin. When I perfume myself. When I perfume myself, my 20 feet ambit exudes musk. Wrapped in the fragrance, I walk about in crowded places. My attar surely turns heads in front of me. It also turns heads behind me. Myself, I just keep strolling, walking on in sweetness, pleased but embarrassed. So that's the poem by Han Lin. So I just wanted to illustrate the fact that many of the poems are about resistance and trauma, but also there are some other aspects of life in this anthology. Yes.
And a beautiful reminder that poetry is not just witness. It's not journalism or an essay. It's a sensual form that celebrates our senses, beauty, our connection to each other as an act of resistance and opposition in itself to the martial and the dominant. And it makes me really want to ask about this poetry as poetry, about the kinds of new language or metaphors, the registers, the music that you're encountering in this work, because you have to choose somehow. So perhaps you're choosing because these are voices that speak in new ways or exciting ways, or that particularly speak to you or speak that resonate, or you think will resonate for readers. And I'm interested in both how the work that you're selecting might refer to poetic histories in Sri Lanka, which obviously has many and complex poetic histories as in Burma, but also are there new developments or new interventions, finding new ways to speak in response to trauma and to recreating the world? And also, I'm curious about whether that's affecting your work, both as translators and poets, as you encounter these new registers, these new voices. What are you hearing? And how is it perhaps affecting you? And Ko Ko, because you read the poem, I'd like to go to you first.
Yes. When the 2021 military coup happened in Burma, I was in Norwich, UK. But I felt very much deeply about it. But then, of course, I am outside the country. So I couldn't really do much or help much. In contrast, there was a military coup in 1988 as well. And I was growing up at that time in Burma. So I witnessed the coup and the consequences of the coup. There was a very dark age of military rule after 1988 until 2010. So I witnessed that. So I grew up, in that kind of scenario. But then the witness writing in this anthology, I think, offered me, what may have been closer to lived experience of the 2021 military coup. And that's how I felt. Yeah.
Is there a particular poem or essay that you'd like to mention for readers to look out for?
Yes, it'll be March the 8th, or the 8th March by Sambru, who is a Kachin activist. It's just a short essay about his experience in a protest in Nichina, Kachin state, where he witnessed some people being shot, in cold blood by the security forces. Yeah, so it's like first an account out of the protests in Nichina. Yeah.
Very immediate form.
Yes.
And Shash, you've written about all of these complexities quite extensively. So, and you're still in the process of editing at the moment as well. So how are these ideas of changing language and changing forms seeming to you at the moment?
We've had to really think hard about the use of English in Sri Lanka, because there's been a change when the British left. The three languages, Sinhala, Tamil, and English, were enshrined in law as official languages. But from the 50s, the Sri Lanka government got rid of English, really. So the generation of poets who grew up being taught in English write a certain way, a different way to the generations that have followed, who haven't had that much exposure to English. And we're noticing the shift. Fundamentally, we don't want to flatten a Sri Lankan voice that's coming through with however they react to the language of English. That comes through with the translators as much as anything, because this is going to be just a single language volume. But there are some poems that work better than others. There are some where the use of the language is much more sophisticated than others. And we've had to make some judgment calls, really. And the only way we've done that is to approach these poems as readers. And if it chimes with us as readers, then we know it will chime with others as readers as well. Translation, again, is so complicated because also English in Sri Lanka is used as a signifier of difference as much as anything, and elitism. So if you speak a certain way, if you speak with a colonial register, you're positioning yourself as being one of the elite. And that's a leftover from colonialism, really, where the civil service was made up by elite sections of society who were schooled by the English to be like them. Conversely, a younger generation of spoken word poets are emerging now with so much energy, and their use of the language is so inspiring because they're now writing as they speak in their everyday interactions with people, which is mixing a bit of Tamil, a bit of Sinhala, a bit of English, and that's flowing. It's sort of like what happens in India, where people just switch between languages, which wasn't happening with the older poets because they were so formal in their approach to language. So we're featuring a few of the spoken word poets, although sometimes, it doesn't really transfer to a page poetry as well. So with that caveat, but we can't leave them out because they are really exciting. How does it affect my practice? I think with Tamil poets, because we've lost our land, and even though there are many who live there still and have lived there throughout the war, we can't claim ownership to it because we are so much at the mercy of the government of Sri Lanka. So many people have been displaced, so many people cannot reclaim the land that's been confiscated from them. So the landscape of northern Sri Lanka and eastern Sri Lanka enters the poetry. And that's how it's memorialized, and that's how it's remembered. And by reading all this Tamil, it's entered my poetry as well, and I can't get away from. I don't write about English landscape. I write about Sri Lankan landscape, the landscape of Tamil, the red soil of Jaffna. So in that way, it's changed the way I write. I don't know whether that's answered your question, but
I'm just enjoying so much listening to this, and I'm sure everyone on the live stream is as well. Please do remember that if you have questions for Ko Ko and Shash, you can put them in the chat and we will receive them and answer them. I am going to ask a couple more. And I want to pick up in a way on Shash, what you were saying, and also Ko Ko, your experience, both of you, your experience of being here in the UK, because as we said close to the beginning, it's not as if it's a transparent or simple process to be publishing this work in English, a colonial imperial language, part of the problem. And we know that Western audiences, like, let's be honest, are pretty extractive. There's a long history of just taking what they want. And in particular, it's been discussed a lot that there's an appetite for trauma. And I'm very struck by the phrase that Vivek Shreya uses in her essay, talking about how her work has been demanded in Canada, and she calls it trauma clowning, and that she's going to resist this demand for performing acceptable forms of trauma. And Ko Ko, I think you've taken this term witness poetry as an alternative, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about the idea of witness poetry and how it resists this kind of typing or stereotyping or insistence, while still representing the complexity, not shying away from the complexity of what's occurred.
Yes, trauma clowning, indeed, and thank you for that. And witness poetry in picking and essays in picking of new issues will not stop spring is not just about trauma. They are about resistance and resilience, as well as many other private and personal issues that concern all of us humans. Having said that, I think I'd like to point out that there's also the notion of pornography of poverty or pornography of suffering. That exploits the poor's condition in order to generate the necessary sympathy for selling, stuff. So terms such as trauma clowning and pornography of poverty rose out of an equal power relationship between survivors of trauma or poverty and those who see trauma or suffering as extractive industry. There is no such, there's for me, for us editors of this anthology and for me as a translator, there's no such unequal power relationship between me and my contributors. And we are not interested in monetizing the anthology, or nor do we represent any political cause for Myanmar, even though some of the poets and essayists, they represent this or that cause. Neither are we interested in interpreting their stories. So we are not retelling their stories. They are telling their own stories. So this writer, Vivek Shraya, who coined the term trauma clowning, said that they did not feel that she was a trauma clown in their latest project, because they were allowed to tell their own story in their own chosen form. And I believe we also let our contributors tell their own stories in their own chosen form.
I think that's such a fantastic distinction about how collaborative work of solidarity at the grassroots by people who are embedded and invested differs from the sort of older practices of anthologizing that we used to see that were much more ethnographic and anthropological. And Shash, I know you have a lot of thoughts about this. Is there anything that you'd like to add or explore?
Yeah, I think the pornography of poverty. To that, I'd also add I've encountered hierarchies of suffering as well, not just in the people in the West wanting to read about trauma, but also when we approached many people in Sri Lanka. It's been a very slow and hard process for us because we were just treated with suspicion because they didn't know who we were. And as soon as they know that it's going to come out in the West, there's a sort of a shutting down because there's no wish to provide fodder for a pornography of suffering. Within that, there's all sorts of distinctions between being a diaspora poet and being a poet who stayed during all the years of the war. And these are sort of the things that we have to try and negotiate. And I don't feel the need to put out my own traumatic experiences as a sort of CV as I approach these poets, as to say, look, I have suffered too, therefore you can talk to me. Because I just refuse to do that. There are many people who just haven't responded to us. So in a way, which is a shame because we can't include their voices. But also, if anything, with this Kate Clancy debacle that's been going on, these important questions of who can talk about other people's suffering and who is allowed to write about them, I think that's the most important question that we've borne in mind. And like Ko Ko says, it's our contributors who speak for themselves in however they want to do it. One of the things I came across as a translator, translating especially rape poems, there are many poets who want to capture the more famous cases where young girls have been raped by security forces, and that has led to protests or has touched society in some way. But when the poets have written about it, they're written in a way where I felt that they've highlighted the aggressor's viewpoint more than the young girl who died. And that's a sort of responsibility I feel, as if I don't want those poems to appear in our anthology. Because when we're translating trauma, we're always keeping in mind the aggression, the cause of the trauma. You can't get away from it. Behind the lines, they're always there. The shadow of violence is always there. And how do we translate that responsibly so as not to give too much exposure to the perpetrators of the violence, and keep the victim or the survivor of the violence with a sense of self-autonomy? And that's something I've had to really bear in mind as I've translated many of the poems, and which ones do we include and which ones do we not. But if I could read a poem now by this fantastic Tamil poet called Ahilan, who's been so helpful to us. He's one of the first poets I reached out to, and I said, look, I have a list of Tamil poets who I'd like to feature, but could you please tell me if there's anybody I've missed out? And he's been fantastic at getting hold of poems for me, because there's real problems in getting hold of these poems as much as anything. So many of the books are out of print. There's one copy in somebody's library somewhere in the middle of Jaffna. And so getting hold of these have been really difficult. So my thanks has to go to Ahilan, who's been a fantastic supporter of our project. So this poem is about a mass grave that was discovered in a place called Chamonix, and it's salt fields, and the salt had preserved the bodies in many ways. But the way he chooses to write about it, it's completely dismissing the perpetrators of the massacre. So this is called Chamonix Iii, and it's my translation. Beneath the fields of salt, the bodies of the unfortunate are kept moist by the tears of those who mourn them. Nothing ripens above the blackened waters. There is no one to gather the ashes of those terror-filled days. Now their memories lie on the edge of forgetfulness, beneath new advertising hoardings. I am building them a memorial, not with stones or with water, but with the sounds flowing in the air, which follow me incessantly.
Thank you for that reading. And we've just had a comment from one of our viewers saying, yes, there's such care and skill and sensitivity required for this task. And I'm very struck by that poem, not least in that it seems to echo that Anna Akhmatova, like almost like a direct translation about the names being on the edge of forgetting and then weaving memory out of words, these two acts. And you mentioned, Shash, that often you're having to reach out to writers or friends of writers or contacts to find the poems because so much has been lost or destroyed. And in fact, there's a poem that I think is in your anthology as well as in the Holmstrom and Ebeling anthology called Buddha Murdered by M.A. Newman, which is about the burning of the Jaffna Public Library that's seen as one of the inciting, most explicit incidents of the beginning of the violence against the Tamil population. And I'm really struck by this because in my work as a queer historian, I look a lot at the destruction of libraries, the destruction of evidence, the destruction of memory, not just, you know, written archives, but oral archives and people's memories as well. And so I wondered if you could both speak a bit about where you've had to go to learn about this, perhaps a bit about what's been lost, or the kind of collections that you imagine might have existed or that you would like to access, and what role kind of memory, that those kind of memory collections of different kinds, unofficial, official, public, play for you. And I'm going to ask Shash first to pick up on what you were saying.
Yeah, the burning of Jaffna Public Library was horrific. I mean, over 90,000 volumes just gone, lost. And it was an act of state-sponsored thuggery. The people who burnt it had police protection. There was a cordon of police, Sinhala police, stopping the Tamil people from actually doing something to save the library. And it burned for 3 days. And if you can imagine that you watched your cultural history just disappear and you could do nothing to save it. And that, if anything, reinforced the view that you had no power. You were completely impotent in this country and on this landscape. And the burning and demolition has carried on because even to this day, no Tamil is allowed to memorialize the war dead. All memorials are destroyed. Just last year, 6 months ago, the memorial that was in Jaffna University for the war dead was destroyed in the middle of the night, even though the people were there filming it. People aren't allowed to, on May 18th is the day we remember the dead. People aren't allowed to congregate. Religious services aren't allowed to take place. The police come and stop them. And the army are there, the military are in the north so much anyway. So there is no way that the Tamil people can memorialize their loss within their own landscape. So poems are one way in which this can be done. And by us publishing these poems in the West is another way we feel of keeping the memory of those who have died alive. Now, we have made the decision not to publish any poems that glorify war in any way. So there are no poems here by combatants of either side. This is more about the ordinary people who may have borne arms, whose children may have borne arms for whatever reason, but it's the parents' grief that we are anthologizing. I could read that poem by M.A. Newman, actually, because when it was published in 1981, he received death threats. It is one of the most anthologized poems in Tamil, and yeah, it's going to be featured in our anthology as well. So it was written straight after the burning of the Jaffna Library, which has been rebuilt. Again, there's all sorts of controversy because a section of the Tamil people didn't want it rebuilt, but the government of Sri Lanka wanted it rebuilt. But the Tamil people have moved their libraries online. So the Nulaham is Tamil for library. The Nulaham Foundation have spent the last 10 years digitizing any books that they can find and putting it online because no one can destroy that. No one can come and dismantle this collection. And it's a fantastic collection of texts that I've used a lot to try and get hold of poems. So this is M.A. Newman's poem, Buddha Murdered, translated by Lakshmi Holmstrom. In my dream last night, Lord Buddha lay shot dead. Government police in civilian clothes shot and killed him. He lay upon the steps of the Jaffna Library, drenched in his own blood. In the darkness of the night, the ministers arrived, raging. His name wasn't on our list, so why did you kill him? No, sirs, they said. No mistake was made. Only, without killing him, it wasn't possible to shoot even a fly. So, okay, but get rid of the corpse at once, the ministers said and vanished. The plainclothesmen dragged the corpse inside and heaped upon it 90,000 rare books and lit the pyre with the Siklavada Sutta. So the Lord Buddha's body turned to ashes, and so did the Dhammapada.
It's so moving to hear a poem that sort of carries the gravity of several generations, that's sort of anthemic. And Ko Ko, your anthology has a section that reaches back to 1988. And I'm wondering about how you gathered those poems, where they were collected, whether there are any that are similarly sort of anthemic or beloved by people, and also about what's missing or what's lost or being destroyed. I don't know if you want to speak to that question.
Yes, no doubt, a lot of it, a lot of poems and memories, if we go back to 1988, must have been lost. But also, many of those memories re-emerged after the 1988 military coup, and many of those poems are still known. And some handwritten poems, scripts, they re-emerged, and then they appeared on social media and other media. So that's how we learned about those existence of those poems, and we're able to get back to the 1988 coup period. So, for instance, Minlu, who was jailed for several years for writing a poem called "What's Going On." He was jailed in 1989, along with his editor and distributor. Of course, they were just doing distributing the. It's a long form poem and distributing the pamphlets illegally or discreetly, clandestinely. So, but they were caught and jailed, and three of them together, they were jailed for several years. So his handwriting emerged again thanks to his daughter, who is also a writer, Yuya. So we decided to include those poems in our anthology. And speaking of which, Minlu also died a few years ago, and we've been reading a lot of poems about death and destruction. So I like to read a poem called "Death is Not the End" from my anthology. The poem is by Dilugale, a poet called Dilugale, and it's my translation. Death is not the end. A bird just died mid-flight, his journey half done, and now in mid-air, it has just taken the last breath. The remaining journey for the lifeless bird is the distance between earth and heaven. The bird is done with dying, but not flying. On earth, however, death usually means the end. Then again, there's exception.
And is that your translation, or yours and Brian's translation?
It's my translation, and it was published before in Cyprus magazine in Ireland. Yeah, all of them are my translations. Yeah, in this collection.
An important point to make, and it's so fantastic for everyone who's joining us to be able to hear these poems. And we do actually have a question about this, about the performances of spoken word poetry. And so part of it is, Shash, whether you considered or you're thinking about providing links to online audio and video so people can enjoy TikTok videos, which, as we know, can be difficult to find. They sort of disappear off. And audio, so that as this beautiful question points out, that even if we don't speak Tamil or Sinhala or this braided new language, the music of the original can be something that we share. So I wonder if you could speak to that. And then, Ko Ko, I'm going to come to you to ask about creating these encounters, other kinds of encounters between readers and writers. So to Shash, to you first.
Yeah, that's something that we can definitely do. The spoken word poets, there's a very, very lively scene in Colombo that I've been able to watch videos of. And also in Jaffna, they've just held their first LGBTQ plus festival of spoken word poetry. And that's been fantastic as well. I mean, we've reached out to all these people, but some people don't want to appear in print for their own reasons and their own safety, and we absolutely respect that. So we can't cover everybody. Unfortunately, one of the websites, the main spoken word websites, we can't access because of our browsers won't let us. So that's something that we probably alert the organizers and see whether there's something that needs to be done. But there are lots of YouTube festivals, spoken word festivals. That's a really good point, and I think we will definitely include links. Yes.
I used to love it when a poetry book came with a CD or even a tape going back to my childhood. I think the interrelation of spoken and written is so important and so particularly underconsidered in the sort of white colonial tradition that's very page based. And I want to ask the question slightly differently to Ko Ko about a different kind of mediation. So your anthology includes a content warning in the introduction. So another way of thinking about how do we manage this relation between audiences and the work. And I wanted to ask you about that and about how you see the relationship or the encounters happening between audiences and the poetry in the anthology, which, as you said, is not just a poetry of trauma or a traumatic poetry, but very wide ranging. But why did you feel you specifically wanted to include that warning? And what other kinds of encounters are you hoping that people will have as they read this poetry?
Yes, when we talk about those strong language or strongly worded poems, we have to talk about what I call participatory poets, who are not, professional poets as such. They write online. They don't necessarily call themselves poet, and they are very much angry and outraged. So maybe some of them use a lot of F words and a lot of things. And coincidentally, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, who is the leader of the junta, his name is, Min Aung Hlaing, and Ma'ala. Ma'ala is initials in Burmese, but also initials for mother or someone who marries his own mother. so, so this term is recurrent in some of the poetry, and and F words, a lot of F words. So I yeah, so I try those poems. I try not to tone down those outrage. It wouldn't be justifiable to tone down some anger against injustice. So I tried my best to translate them into English, but of course, swear words are untranslatable. They are best in the mother tongue, right? So sometimes I don't manage them, and those times I just leave. Like I just say like they go obscenes or something like that. So that's how I do it. And of course, contents warning or trigger warning, we had to put them in place. When our publisher reminded us that some of the poems are strongly worded and so on. And that's one way I think we mediated the encounter between the reader and the translations, I think, just to, by putting a trigger warning. Yeah, that's one way. Another way is, of course, sometimes I just don't translate don't translate obscene words and just say that these are obscenes and so on. Yeah.
Shash, did you want to jump in there?
I think just thinking about re-traumatizing people through the reading of our anthologies, we're very aware of the reader, but also we need to bear in mind the translator, because when you translate, you enter a poem and you make it your own. And often people who are translating have their own traumas. And this is something I was very lucky to have the time to explore when I had my residency at the National Centre for Writing last year. I didn't really come to any conclusions, but I have practices that I have to follow in order to translate safely for myself. So I don't do it at night because then I won't be able to sleep and things like that. But I didn't realize just how much translating traumatic material re-traumatizes already traumatized translators. And that's something that I think we should recognize.
Absolutely. The work that you're both doing is so valuable, and in creating these transnational connections that otherwise couldn't necessarily occur, perhaps on such a large scale for those of us who aren't fluent in every global language, is so important and is so under rewarded in our culture, when in fact it's what enables us to be in connection with each other. So I want to, on behalf of the audience that we can't hear and can't see, which is very often how we're doing our work anyway, when we're writing or translating, we don't know who is going to see or hear our work, to say a huge thank you to both of you. And we're drawing to the end of our event, but I wonder if each of you would like to read something, possibly some of your own work, or possibly another poem from that anthology that is important to you. It would be great to hear your voices again before we close the room. Shash, you look like you're ready.
I have a poem by the Tamil poet Nilandan, which I've translated. Nilandan, the end of the war in 2009 was brutal. The UN estimates about 40,000 civilians were massacred. And Nilandan was one of the people who was caught up in this end of this war, and he spent 3 months, burying people, digging bunkers, suffering. And it's taken him about 10 years to write these poems, which have never been published in Tamil, but which I have the great privilege of translating. So this is a poem. The end happened by this lagoon called Nandi Kadal Lagoon. So this is a poem of his called Nandi Kadal, August 2012. So that's 3 years after the end of the war. This iron and this ash are all that remains after those who had lived and breathed had been burnt away. They plundered the precious remains and heaped the bones and the rusting ironware in the salt-laden mud. Now, after 2 seasons of rain, dreams lie rusting in the salt fields. The sun sinks behind trees and drowns in the waters of Nandikaral. The waterfowl wait, holding fast the last words of those who have vanished.
Thank you. And Coco, I wonder about the epilogue to your anthology, whether that might be a place we could include.
Yes, I put this poem in as epilogue because this one is quite meaningful, and it's not about the people on either side of the conflicts. This is about someone who is trapped like tall grass between the fight of the two bulls, right, as we say in Burmese. And this poet is a participatory poet, and I don't know him before. I didn't know him before. I don't know him now either. Yeah, I got the permission from the poet to the journal that he published online. And his name is Minyang A, and the poem is Map of Myanmar. All that remain are a bubble in my fist, a water bottle in my backpack, and a heap of bones. What's next? They asked. No next, I answered. No need to climb the mountains of the past. No need to row towards the rivers and rivulets of the past. The sacred text says there is a whetstone here. There is Nasrages there. What's next? They asked. No next, I answered. For a clue, I will leave this poem so you can work out the depth and the breadth of the country.
Phenomenal. Thank you both so much for these maps that you've shared with us. I'm sure everyone will now be following the link that was provided in the chat. Please make sure that you download and share the ebook of Picking Off New Shoots Will Not Stop the Spring, Witness Poems and Essays from Burma, Myanmar, 1988 to 2021. And do look out next year for the publication of Shash's anthology, Out of Sri Lanka, from Blood Axe. Thank you both so much. Thank you to the National Centre of Writing, to Kate, Ellie and Martin, who made this event possible. And thank you to everyone who joined us when there are so many other compelling and urgent demands on all our time and witnessing. They are all connected to each other. And this has been such a really profound reminder of the way that poetry and translation and conversation bear witness even in what feel like the most impossible moments and situations. So thank you.
And thank you so as well for fantastically chairing this event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, so.